This lesson will be broken into two parts, one for the first meeting, class meeting of the week, and one for the second, simply because there's a little bit of prep that goes in for it. So I'm going to want to give you some time to get your pieces traced out, and you'll have to draft your facing pieces, which I'll show you how to do. So this will be part one, will be the preparation for putting the facing in, and then we'll get to sewing it in the second class meeting. This next in our series of samples is our one-piece facing. And this is a great chance for you to capture both finishing the armhole and the neck opening of your garments by turning it through the shoulder. This is one of the techniques, it's one of my favorites, that really promotes a really clean edge without having to go in and fuss and make a lot of facings. So we're going to be making a facing that really kind of will capture and be easy for you to turn to the inside of your garment. So we're going to start today. You're going to need your front sloper and your back sloper and some pattern paper, and we'll get going on tracing out. For the body of our sample, what I'd like you to do is to take your sloper, I'm working with the front first, put it on the fold of your fabric. You can use muslin, you can use scrap fabric, anything that you want to do for this sample, it really doesn't matter. Line it up carefully, and then what I do is right onto the fabric. Because it's a muslin, you don't want to do this onto fashion fabric directly. You never want to draw on fashion fabric. You always want to have all your drawing done on. But muslin that's what muslin is for, is to draw on. So what I'm going to do now is to go around and just put in my stitching line all the way around the pattern. I'm only really going to worry about from midway dart up. I'm not really going to concern. We're not going to be putting the darts in or anything. I really want to concentrate on the actual facing. And then once I've got my stitching line in, what I can do is go in with my ruler. And again, I like to put my straight lines in first, and then just draw a 1/2 inch out here, 1/2 inch out at the shoulder. Again, extending beyond, so I have my cross marks is here. And then I'll walk my ruler around the 1/2 inch, again making sure that I'm crossing at the corners, that they're a perfect 45-degree angle at the corners. So I'm going to just mark this. This is looking like the stitching line because it's a curve. So I'm following the curve, and I'm following the curve around the neckline. Make sure, particularly at the neckline, that you square it off so you don't get that little sweetheart that happens when it's curved. Okay, so tracing along the sloper line with a dotted line, because that will be my stitching line. So I'm adding the seam allowance out, okay? And then I'm going to go around and put in my cut lines. I'm going to do this for the front, and I'm also going to do this for the back, remembering that you're going to have a 1/2 inch off the center back. So let's get the body of the garment, again, on the back and the front. Please make sure that they're the same length at the side seam. We'll go all the way down to the side seam, but you won't have to bother with the darts. Okay? So now I've done the same thing with the back. I put my sloper down, and dotted my line around so I saw where my stitching is. You can use straight lines if you want to. But I've traced around first, and then I added out the 1/2 inch seam allowance. We talked about the dart in the facing being taken out, but for the body of the garment, you do need to put the dart in because you have the rest of the garment here. We are only going to be concentrating on the top of the garment. We're not going to worry about what goes on here, so we're not going to be putting in darts, but you do need your side seam for this process, okay? So that's the back. Next step is to create the facing for the garment. So what you want to do is to go ahead and trace your bodice. We'll start with the front, as always. And you don't have to trace the entire bodice. You want pretty much from the apex up is good. And what you really want to pay attention to is where your actual apex is on your garment, because we do want to stay away from that. So that information will get transferred on to this tracing that you've done. So now what I want to do is to start by determining the depth of my facing. So I usually go, for me, I usually go about 2¼ inches is usually kind of my go-to on the depth of a facing at the armhole. So what I'm going to do now is to walk this down and just follow the 2¼ mark and give myself a little bit of a guideline around my armhole, using my armhole as a guide. Okay, so now I know here I followed my armhole. I can take now my French curve. And again, the first thing that I want to do here always is to make sure that you right angle and square off anything that you do so it doesn't give you that little sweetheart curve when you go to cut it. So now I'm going to line up my French curve so that I follow this curve, just so I get some consistency here. And now what I can do is kind of free shape from here, depending on what you're doing with this. So if it's going to be a facing or if you're going to drop a lining from it, the one thing I do need to do is to stay away from the apex. You want to keep the facing away from the apex. Sometimes, depending on the fabric, what I'll do is I'll do the 2¼ up here as well. And then what I'll do is to kind of follow this along and then come down and meet it like so. So this area now in here is going to become my facing. This will be the pattern for my facing, and I'm going to square this off. I'm actually going to square this off a ½ inch here, and then just give myself a nice curve following this. Sometimes this is easier to do by hand, honestly. But I do want to get a nice curve happening here. And this is going to become a facing pattern. Okay. Now what I can do is to go ahead, the front is going to be on the fold. I'm going to add my seam allowance. So I like to do my straight seams first, extending them out so I get that cross. And then I'll walk my ruler around, again, making sure that I create this right angle at the corner. And then I can walk my ruler around, adding my ½ inch all the way around. Again, making sure that I cross here. And I'm going to do the same on the front. Give myself a ½ inch. Bring it up a little bit so that I can cross it. Again, flat, nice and flat, so you don't get that sweetheart shape. And again, all the way up here. And that's going to be my front facing. What I'm also going to do is to go in, and now I'm going inside the pattern instead of outside the pattern. I'm going inside the pattern, and I'm going to create this little 1/4 inch. The 1/4 inch is going to be the part that turns under that gives you the nice finish on the edge of the facing. So this is really a stitching line, this is a folding line, but I want to make sure that I've got it right to the end. Okay, and here, get this nice and straightened out. Okay, so this is it. This is my front facing now, and now I'll go on to the back. Now onto my back, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to trace off my sloper. This is the back. And again, I'm using, for now, the outside, remembering slopers do not have seam allowance on them. So seam allowance is really almost always the last thing that happens on a pattern. You want to make sure that that perfect fit happens first before you start adding seam allowance. Seam allowance is the last thing that goes on. And again, you only have to trace from, this is the mid back, so about 3 or 4 inches down from the mid back. Okay, so this is my back. Now I know that my front has to meet up with my back. So I had the 2 1/4 inches, which I'm going to now put here. Marking it here. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to walk my ruler around at 2 1/4 inches, following the curve. So I'm not measuring straight, I'm following the curve here, just so I get it to be nice and even and consistent. Again, I'm really trying to avoid the darts, and I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the front. I'm going to mark 2 1/4 here, and I'm going to come out, square it out, and do the same thing. I can just draw a nice arc that will happen, and taking my French curve, this one looks a little closer here, yeah. And again, I want to make sure that my first little, at least 1/4 inch is nice and flat. And I can blend this in to here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is take my front and just make sure that it's exactly the same, which it is. So I'm comparing my front to my back, making sure that it's exactly the same, because anything that gets sewn together needs to be exactly the same size. So here, what I'm going to do is to close up the dart. I am going to add my seam allowance first. This is, again, you have to remember here, you have your dart, so you have to add it so you get the dart tilt in it. And then you can walk around adding your seam allowance. I'm adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance to this, just like I did with the front. Again, square off. That's really important to square off on all the corners of your pattern. So I could cross a little better. And we're going to come back to this area in a bit. Extend this. So you see how that makes a nice square right corner. I'm going to come down. This is actually going to end up being my cut line. Forgot to add this one here. Okay, so that's now my back facing. So what I'm going to do next is to add in that 1/4 inch, just so I'm keeping track of it. I'm going to add in the 1/4 inch turn. So the prepping of this really takes the most time, putting it together. This is a great technique for keeping everything clean, and honestly, it's easier to finish garments this way than almost any other way because it's really beautiful. It actually ends up being a little faster too. Okay, so this is now my back facing. What I'm going to do next is to cut it out so that I can close the dart. The next thing I'm going to do, this is my back facing now, the next thing I'm going to do is I have to close up this dart. So finding the center of the dart, I'm going to roll a dot that's 1/4 of an inch because this dart is a 1/2 inch wide, and then I'm just going to draw a line straight down the pattern. I'm then going to slash it with a scissor from the shoulder to the vanishing point, stop, and then from the bottom to the vanishing point, leaving just that little tiniest bit of paper. I always compare it to when you're little and that tooth is just about to fall out. There's that one little piece that's keeping that tooth in the mouth. That's really what you want, is this really tiny little piece of paper that's keeping the pattern together for the moment. And then what you want to do is to rotate, and you'll see where you had this little tiny shape before, now it's going to become a straight line. So you're going to move this over, rotate it. You can rotate it in either direction. If you wanted to keep it on the straight, you can rotate it this way. It doesn't really matter. And then once you have your 2 dart lines lined up, you can tape them together. And that's going to give you your facing. Now you should have a nice straight line, okay? What you have down here is a little bit of fill that has now been moved. So you can go ahead and just tape in a piece of paper, because you also want to true up your little manipulation because it's going to shift a little bit because of the turn. So you're going to fill in this part, and then take, again, your French curve and just true this up so it's a nice straight line. Okay, then you can go back in and cut this off. And that's your facing. You've made your pattern. So I have my back facing. I'm going to cut 2, and then I have my front facing as well. I'm ready to cut my fashion fabric now. I have my front facing. I'm going to cut 1 on the fold, and again, make sure you keep track of your notches for your armhole. And on the back, I'm going to cut 2 because I have a seam up the back. So there'll be 2 of the fashion fabric. The next step is to attach the interfacing to the fashion fabric. So you're going to put the interfacing on the wrong side and line it all up. Again, if you have, if you've trimmed off your 1/4 inch all the way around, you're going to have to really measure carefully and get it centered. If you're using sew-in, you can go ahead and baste it, lining everything up at the neck and the shoulders, and leaving the 1/4 inch, making sure that you have a good 1/4 inch because this is going to get folded over the interfacing to hold it in place, okay? So you're going to baste the interfacing to the front and of course to both backs, making sure that that 1/4 inch is showing so you can turn it under.